Because saying, I understand how you feel, can put some clients on the defense. And with other clients, they may love that. We hear those stories where like, oh, it was great, the crisis worker understood how I felt. But I think ethically, it's too much of an ethical risk to say that you're going to encounter a client that's going to love that you say, I understand. Because you might get a client that gets really defensive, like, how can you understand what I'm going through? And then, that rapport is not going to be established, and they're in crisis. So you don't want to take that chance. But you can, if it feels appropriate, kind of at least acknowledge that the situation was intense, overwhelming, terrible, tragic, as a way of connecting with the client. And I hope that's clear. We try to get as much as we can of the internal experience of the client. In other words, what the client is experiencing, what the situation was like for them, to go through whatever it is they went through and are going through. So we really try to invite the clients to be as descriptive as they feel comfortable being about what this is like for them, what they're feeling, and what the situation, really how it felt to them. Because that's going to go directly into their perception of the precipitating event or the problem itself. And just always being aware of nonverbal cues as often as we're aware of verbal cues. When does the client seem to withdraw? When does the client seem to look away or look down? When does the client seem to shake his or her leg or wring their hands, depending on what they're talking about? We don't want to jump to interpretation about what that means in the moment, because it could mean anything. But we want to be aware that whatever it is that's going on is affecting the client. And that is a wonderful opportunity for us to, instead of interpret in our minds what's happening, to invite the client to tell us what's going on. If they're able to, if they're verbal enough to do so. Most of the time we want to use open-ended questions. So the client tells us a little bit about what's going on, and we want to use some what questions and how questions. And so what was that like for you to see that? What was that like for you to hear that? How was that so terrifying for you, as you described? How was it that event really made you completely shut down in the moment and move away? What was going on for you? So a lot of what, a lot of how questions. But sometimes we need to use the closed-ended questions, which are questions that give us very specific responses because they're fact-gathering questions. When did this occur? What time did this incident happen? And sometimes that's going to be important to ask, depending on what's going on. But we don't want to ask too many closed-ended questions, and we don't want to ask too many why questions, because that can lead to the client shutting down. They feel like you're an investigator, maybe more, and they're going to get a lot of those questions, I'm assuming, from other people. So right now, your main job is to connect with the client and to help them expand their experience. So we don't want to use too many questions that ask why, and close-ended questions. Another thing that's important is when the client introduces into the conversation some type of phrase or word, like as the handout says, where there's a lot of energy connected to it. And it could be excited energy, it could be nervous energy, it could be like frustration, or there's a marked difference. It elicits some type of energy around it. We want to ask about that. it could seem very clear to us in our assumption based on what they're saying and how they're reacting, like, oh, I can tell that really is angering the client, or it's really upsetting the client. In a crisis situation, we don't want to make those assumptions. If we see that shift in energy, we want to ask about it. We want to, even if it seems really obvious or really clear in our head in terms of how that's connected, we don't want to assume that. So when you see that the client is introducing, also introducing something new word that describes what they're going through, we want to ask about that, because that can really help get us into their world and their experience about what's going on, which will eventually help us connect that to their coping mechanisms and their coping skills. Excuse me. Some basic skills I think still are important. Paraphrasing. For us, a lot of the times, that not only tells the client that we're listening, but it helps us clarify what the client is saying. Reflection of feelings is always important, and always something that allows the client to know that we're listening to them, that we're trying to be supportive of where they're at. I think a really key important response is summarizing. Summarizing helps, again, put the client's telling of events in a particular sequence. It does help us check in to see if we're with the client on the same page, but it also helps put some order to the client's thoughts and reflect back to them what they've told us. And that can be very stabilizing for the client. It can help them, again, feel more in control. It can help them breathe a little easier when you're able to kind of recount through a certain sequence of time what the client has just been explaining. It can be really powerful. The B in the ABC model is identifying the problem. That is the most important piece. And it's usually the piece that you can spend the most time on when you're working with clients. It's the piece that's going to give you an insight into how this crisis is really affecting the client and what it means for them. So once you're able to better understand what the meaning is for the client and how it's affecting them, then you're going to be able to work with the client collaboratively to come up with ways to shift their perception a little bit and work on some more coping mechanisms and skills. Excuse me. Thank you. If we try to jump in with a supportive comment or an empowering statement too soon before the client feels understood, then they may not accept it. This is why this is the most important part of the crisis intervention, is they need to feel that you've spent some time understanding their perception of the event. And they're not going to necessarily think about it in that way, the way I've explained it. They're not going to be sitting there thinking, I'm going to have to keep on talking until you really understand what's going on, because they're in crisis. But that is emotionally what they need. They need to feel that sense of validation. Their story needs to be validated before they'll allow any type of input on our part that's going to try to shift that for them or be supportive for them. So we need to see how meaningful this is for them. in their relationships, in their life, in their different roles. If it's a situation where it's a crisis with a mother involving her children, her children being taken away, or an abusive situation, then we need to understand really how that person sees her role as a mother. What does it mean to be a mother? What does it mean to be a mother to these particular children? What does it mean to be a mother to this particular child? How is that different than how they were a child with their mother? Or how is it different to be a mother to one particular child as opposed to another particular child? We're going to need to know the meaning of their role or their roles related to what's happening in that crisis situation. We have to have a clear understanding of that. That's particular to that client or that family. And that can take some time. It's not about rushing through those questions. It can take time to get there. Clients are going to answer the questions they hear or they think they hear, and so, or they're going to answer with whatever's more meaningful for them, and so we need to pay attention to what they're answering, how they're answering. But if we're still trying to gather a sense of something in particular, then it's okay to go back at another time a little bit later and try to restate the question or ask the question in a different way, because that gives us information as well, and it helps the client give us more information about where they're at. Trying to figure out what happened that brought on the crisis, the precipitating event, is another thing that's going to take some time for some clients. And that requires a lot of patience on our part. It could be that it's just emotionally difficult for the client to articulate what the precipitating event is. And that's okay, because it's a difficult situation for them. But we want, as much as we can, to try to gently and collaboratively invite the client to, as much as they can, describe what were the events or the event that led up to the crisis situation. And that's going to be important because that's going to help us, again, craft and come up with some coping mechanisms, some problem-solving strategies. They can help them currently, and they can hopefully help them with future stressors so that it may not develop into a crisis. So spending some time with the precipitating event is an important piece. Usually the stress that leads to the crisis comes from a few different areas, as you'll see. The client feels a loss of control, loss of self-esteem or worth, loss of nurturance, and some type of sense that they're being forced to adjust to a change in their role in their life or a change in their life. And so the reasons why they may feel forced to do that and the reasons why they feel that they can't fulfill that are varied, and that would be part of what we would try to find out and figure out with them. Because a lot of us sometimes feel a loss of control, a loss of self-esteem, any of these, and it doesn't develop into a crisis situation. So whatever happened here must have been particularly meaningful for them, for it to develop into this situation. And sometimes the answers are pretty straightforward, but or they may seem pretty straightforward, but we still need to probe and find out what's going on. Um, we need to find out their level of functioning, where they're at. Again, some clients may be really immobile, some may not. So we need to ask a little bit about what their normal functioning is like, what they're normally doing at a certain time, how they may more typically respond to a similar stressor, and see where they're at in this moment. So what we mean by that is, do you think that you'll be able to sit with your kids tonight and watch television with them without breaking down, crying, or without being overly angry? Do you think you're the only one now that can pick up your kids from school? Is that something that you can do right now? Do you feel like you can do that? Do you feel like you can be here the rest of the day and find something that's going to make you feel a little bit better? You said you liked listening to music, you liked relaxing in your room for a little while. Are those things that you're able to do? Do you think you'll be able to do that? Do you have a sense like that's going to help get you through the day? Do you think you can sit alone? Or do you feel like you need somebody with you? It can be anything that literally is about functioning in the day and you assessing that. So whatever the crisis situation is, you want to get a sense of what typically happens for the client, and are they able to do that? What's their level of current distress still? And you can always ask that in a gentle way, but it needs to, you need to have a clear picture of what may come up for the client and what the client can and can't handle, and for how long. So the client may say, I'll be okay if I can sit here for about 15 minutes or 30 minutes. I think I'll be able to do that. Or they might say, no, I don't think I can do any of that today. So that's what you need to assess in as much detail as possible. And so that's I was saying, finding out what normally happens, and in the handout, that's kind of what I meant with the pre-crisis level of functioning. Right? So you need to know how they were functioning before the crisis occurred. That's going to give you some clues as to where they're at now. We always have to ask about functioning level. We always have to ask about any type of suicidal, homicidal, abusive tendencies. If that's anywhere part of the crisis situation at all, then we need to know where the client is in any of that. Once you've established that kind of interaction, then it can be an opportunity for empowering statements, validating statements, supportive statements, giving some clients some factual information about what some typical responses are. If they had a child or a teenager that ran away and maybe got injured or got hurt, and other things that were going on that escalated to a crisis situation, if there's some helpful educational information about why teens run away, or what seems to help in that situation, that's when you can deliver some pieces of educational information, if it seems like that's something that the client is open to and can process. Highlighting choice. Empowering statements is always about highlighting the choices that clients have. They may have no control over the situation, but they can make small decisions, small choices about how they're going to respond to the situation, and as much as they're able to. So anytime a client is making a choice, or they're able to make a choice and decision that is a helpful one for them, that is something that we want to highlight, we want to comment on, we want to see that's something they can do more of. Even talking with us, even staying still if they feel they need to stay still, is a choice they're making. I talked about level of functioning. If they're making a choice to stay still and not try to engage with their children if they know it's not going to be productive, then that's a decision. They're making a choice. That's a little bit of control that you want to highlight that they're having in their life, so that they can start building on that feeling of returning to a sense where they're having more control in their life, even on a moment-to-moment basis. So empowering statements is really about, in crisis, is about us being able to notice, look for, and highlight the choices that they're making and the decisions that they're making to try to cope. And even if it's decisions that they're making that, as I said, is not going to make the situation worse, that's important too, because that's also a choice. You may have an opportunity to do some reframing, not as often, I think, depending. You don't always have to throw in a reframe. And so this is the idea of getting to a point in the conversation where now you're going to try to build some coping skills, and that means that, going through this situation, you're going to come out with new skills. You're going to come out with new problem-solving mechanisms that can keep you from entering into crisis again. So what you're doing is you're kind of reframing the danger part of the crisis into it was an opportunity. But you want to do that, in small scales. You definitely, you don't want to invalidate the situation or invalidate the pain. But for some clients, you'll see that they're getting to a place, and you're checking in with them about how they're doing, how they're feeling, where they're at right now. So they'll give you some clues as to whether or not some reframing statements can be beneficial for them. How have they coped in the past? What have been successful coping mechanisms in the past for similar situations or different situations? We always want to start with what they've used in the past, because it could be that while their coping mechanisms were overwhelmed and they weren't able to use them in a crisis situation, reminding them of things that they've used in the past, trying to strengthen what they've used in the past, can also go a long way to help preventing a future crisis. So if they've reached out to a friend before and that's helped them, and they've gotten to a point where at this point they didn't do that, things were escalating in their home or in an interaction, and they didn't reach out to a friend or how they're feeling, because in the past they've been able to handle it to a certain point. This time they weren't able to. So highlighting that that's something they've done before can help them with, okay, so next time I'll do that sooner. I thought it could go to a certain point, but now with this happening, I know that maybe I shouldn't get that close to that feeling overwhelmed and that stress. So I need to call on a friend sooner, and you can talk about that. So sometimes tweaking and strengthening what's worked in the past can go a long way. And whenever possible, we want to use coping mechanisms that they've used before, because they've already done it. It's part of who they are. It's not something they have to learn again. And so that's another tool for them in their toolbox. we can then move toward exploring potential new coping mechanisms. And so the thing about exploring new coping mechanisms, however, is as much as possible, we still want that to come either from the client or in collaboration with the client. If the coping mechanisms and the coping skills come from the client, they are more likely to follow through with those. They're more likely to utilize them, to use them. And so, you know, you're a piece of that conversation too. It's always collaborative. So what I'm saying is I don't want it to seem like we're gonna put it all on the client and make it an additional burden, like they have to come up with everything on their own. We can help facilitate their ideas, but what I am saying is that teaching them new skills that they haven't used at all before it can have a place, but usually that's the last thing that we want to do. We can facilitate and guide the conversation so that the client can help. We can help the client come up with new coping mechanisms, and that's going to be stronger. They're going to utilize that more often. Yeah. So that's an important piece when we're talking about new coping mechanisms and new skills. Are there any questions right now that you might have? Okay. Okay.
We're right at an hour, so if you want to...
Okay. So we're about in an hour. That's good. One of the last things is that you have is some information on strategies to use on the phone, telephone strategies. I'm going to look at actually the slide that goes with the severely disturbed caller, a few slides in. And one of the things to remember is always to try to slow down the emotions of the client and try to get them to focus on, as I said, the here and now. So what's going on right now, what's happening in this moment, what is it like for you to, to have called. So you want to do what you can to slow it down. It may not completely slow down the caller, but you want to try to at least put some speed bumps in that. Of course, never converse with them or affirm any delusions that they may be having or hallucinations. You want to check in about any type of medication usage that they may not be on, or they may be not on their medication than they should be. You want to keep any expectations about the call and what you can do in the call realistic, which means that you always want to have at the end any type of referral information available to give to them, and assess any type of lethality, of course. A lot of this is very similar but to one-on-one, but some of the things that that we can check in on one-on-one is a lot of nonverbal cues and a lot of spending some time with building the rapport. On the phone we may not have that luxury, so it needs to be a little bit, we need to be more upfront about what the limitations are, what the expectations are, what we can help with, but also a little bit more assessment of where they're at and in terms of the severity of their emotional state. So I think those are some things to keep in mind, and I think, yeah, I think some of the other slides on that hopefully are a little bit self-explanatory. but they can always email questions